The vanishing tourist. As the last days of October approached, a group of tourists, eager to escape the bustling city life, set out for a remote tropical island off the coast of Southeast Asia. The island was known for its crystal-clear turquoise waters, pristine white beaches, and lush, mountainous forests. But despite its beauty, the locals always maintained a distant attitude towards outsiders. They never spoke much about the island's dark past, and most tourists who visited seemed to mysteriously vanish without a trace. The group, consisting of 8 people, arrived at the island with high spirits. There were the curious ones, like Laura and Tom, who were always seeking adventure, and then there were the more cautious, like Mark and Emily, who took comfort in staying within the safety of the resort. The island's only guide, Adi, welcomed them with a reserved smile, but his eyes always darted nervously as he led them to their accommodations. The first few days were idyllic. The tourists swam in the crystal waters, explored the dense forests, and enjoyed the vibrant island culture. But there was something unsettling beneath the surface. The locals never ventured near the tourist resorts, and whenever they did interact with the group, they spoke in hushed tones and avoided eye contact. There was an unspoken rule about keeping away from the island's deeper paths. No one ever asked too many questions, for fear of stirring up something ancient. One morning, Jonathan, a young man in the group, went missing. The others had assumed he had gone out for an early morning walk on the beach, a favorite pastime of his. But as the day wore on, there was no sign of him. At first, they thought he was just wandering off, enjoying the solitude of the island. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, they realized something was terribly wrong. Adi, the guide, was immediately informed. He appeared at the resort, his face pale with anxiety. He stammered, telling them that this wasn't the first time someone had gone missing on the island. But he said little else, offering only vague explanations. His nervousness made the group uneasy. That night, after a tense dinner, the group decided to take matters into their own hands. Determined to find Jonathan, they set out into the dense jungle under the cover of darkness. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the night. But what made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up wasn't the sounds of the jungle, it was the strange, whispering voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves. They walked for hours, calling Jonathan's name, but there was no answer. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more unsettling it became. The whispering grew louder, and shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of their eyes. The group began to feel as though they were being watched, their every move carefully observed by an unseen presence. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It came from Emily, who had wandered off slightly to the left of the group. They rushed toward her, only to find her standing frozen, her eyes wide with terror. Before they could ask what had happened, she pointed ahead. There, lying motionless on the forest floor, was Jonathan's backpack. It was open, and the contents were scattered across the ground, his camera, his journal, a broken pair of sunglasses. But there was no sign of Jonathan himself. The group searched frantically, calling his name, but it was as if the island itself had swallowed him whole. But the mystery deepened as they noticed strange markings in the dirt around the backpack, ancient symbols, worn and faded, as though carved into the earth centuries ago. It was as though the island was alive, and the very land itself was playing tricks on them. Fear gripped their hearts as they realized they were no longer alone. The whispering voices grew louder, now accompanied by faint, almost imperceptible footsteps. The group was being encircled by unseen forces. Every rustle in the underbrush felt like a predator closing in. And then, one by one, the others began to disappear. Laura was the next to vanish. One moment, she was standing beside Mark, and the next, she was gone without a sound, as if she had never been there. The group searched in a panic, calling out for her, but there was no response. The island was swallowing them, one by one. Mark, unable to bear the tension any longer, decided to run. He bolted down the narrow path, desperate to escape. But when he looked over his shoulder, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. The entire forest was alive with movement. Figures, dark and indistinct, appeared in the shadows. They were watching him. The air grew thick, and the whispering voices intensified. Mark's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The island wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. The island had been home to an ancient cult that once performed dark rituals, offering up sacrifices to the spirits of the island in exchange for power and immortality. Every few years, the cult would claim new victims, tourists who wandered too far, lured by the island's beauty. Once they entered the sacred forests, they became part of the island's twisted history. As the last of the group, Mark stumbled through the jungle, his body shaking with fear. He couldn't understand how he had survived this long. He could hear the voices now, clear and distinct, calling his name, his real name, not just a whisper. It was as though the island had taken on a mind of its own. In his panic, Mark stumbled upon an old, crumbling stone structure hidden deep in the forest. It looked like an ancient temple, half swallowed by vines and decay. Inside, he found the answer to the island's curse. On the walls, there were faded carvings, images of tourists, their faces twisted in agony, being led into the forest by shadowy figures. The last thing Mark saw before the darkness took him was a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the blackness. The island had claimed him too, just as it had claimed the others. The next morning, when the rescue team arrived, there was no sign of the tourists. No bodies, no traces, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. Just the eerie silence of the island. But if you listen closely, you might hear the faint whisper of their voices, carried on the wind, a warning to those who would dare venture too far. The cursed hotel room. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the everyday grind, a chance to relax and explore. But for Mark and his girlfriend, Emily, the trip to the quaint seaside town would turn into something far darker than they ever could have imagined. Arriving at the historic hotel nestled on a cliff, overlooking the crashing waves below, they were charmed by its old-world elegance. The hotel's exterior boasted faded brick walls, large wooden windows, and a vintage sign that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with thick carpets, antique furniture, and an eerie quiet that felt out of place for such a luxurious place. They checked in with a clerk who appeared a bit too old to still be working there, his hand shaking slightly as he handed them the room key. "Room 217, the clerk muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a special room." Mark didn't think much of it. The clerk's cryptic words seemed like nothing more than an old man's ramblings. They made their way up to the second floor, passing dusty portraits of long-gone guests, the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. Room 217 was at the far end of a narrow corridor, and as they approached, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier. The door to their room creaked open with an unsettling noise. The room itself was large, with a king-sized bed, a small sitting area by the window, and a wardrobe in the corner. It was decorated in vintage furniture that spoke to an earlier time, but it was oddly cold. Despite the thick curtains, the room felt strangely exposed, like they were being watched from outside. As they unpacked, Mark noticed something peculiar, a faint, musty smell emanating from the wardrobe. He opened it, revealing rows of dusty old clothes, forgotten and untouched. But there was something else. Tucked in the back, behind the clothes, was an old, yellowed envelope, its seal broken. Curiosity piqued, Mark opened the envelope and found a letter. It was dated over 50 years ago, written in a hurried, scrawling hand. "To whoever finds this, do not stay in this room. There is a curse here, a presence that will never leave. It feeds on fear and sadness, and it is always watching. If you value your life, leave before it's too late. This is not a warning, but a plea. The curse is real." The letter was signed by a name Mark couldn't read, partially smudged by time. "Emily, you won't believe what I found," Mark said, holding up the letter. But when he turned around, he saw her staring at the window, her face pale, her eyes wide. "I feel like we're not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. That night, the hotel seemed to come alive with sounds. The faint tapping of footsteps echoed in the hallways, the creaking of the floorboards above them. Mark tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling himself it was just the old building settling, but he couldn't ignore the cold drafts that seemed to move through the room despite the closed windows. Around midnight, Emily woke with a start. She gasped for air, clutching her chest as if something was suffocating her. Her face was contorted in terror. "Mark! Something's in the room," she screamed, her voice high-pitched, filled with fear. Mark jumped out of bed, but when he looked around, The room was still. The only sound was the muffled crash of waves against the rocks below. He rushed to Emily's side, trying to calm her down. "Emily, there's nothing here. It's just the nerves. You're just having a nightmare." But Emily wasn't listening. She pointed to the wardrobe. "I saw it," she whispered, trembling. "I saw its eyes. It's watching us." Mark turned to the wardrobe, but the room was empty. Still, a deep, gnawing fear had taken root in his chest. Something wasn't right. He could feel it now. Something ancient and malevolent lingered in that room, something that had been waiting for them. The next morning, they went down to the lobby to check out. The old clerk was there, his face even more haggard than the day before. "Leaving so soon?" he asked with a knowing look. Mark hesitated. "We're checking out early." "Is there something wrong with room 217? The clerk's face darkened, his eyes widening. "You shouldn't have stayed in that room," he said, his voice barely audible. "The curse is real. Many have tried to leave, but it doesn't let them go. It holds them here, trapped in time, forever." Before Mark could respond, the clerk handed him a small, old key. It looked identical to the one for room 217. "Take this with you," the clerk said. "Return it when you leave this place for good. Don't let it fall into the wrong hands." Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he took the key, his hands shaking. He didn't understand, but something told him that if he didn't leave soon, he might never leave at all. That evening, Mark and Emily packed their bags in silence. The weight of the room, the curse, and the warning hung over them like a shadow. As they left the hotel and headed for their car, Mark glanced back at the old building, now shrouded in mist. The lights in the windows flickered, and for a brief moment, he swore he saw a face, pale, hollow eyes staring out at him. They never spoke of the hotel again, but Mark could never shake the feeling that something had followed them, something that wasn't quite human. And as the years passed, he would sometimes hear the faint sound of footsteps behind him, the brush of cold air on his neck. Every now and then, in the dead of night, he would wake up to see a shadow standing at the foot of his bed, its eyes glowing in the darkness. The curse, it seemed, had never truly let them go. Ghostly voices in the cabin. The cabin stood deep in the Blackwood forest, a lonely structure hidden away from the main roads. It had been abandoned for decades, yet whispers among the locals spoke of strange happenings, the sound of voices echoing from within, even when no one was inside. Ethan Carter, a journalist specializing in paranormal investigations, had heard the rumors. Skeptical but intrigued, he decided to spend a weekend in the cabin, hoping to debunk the myths surrounding it. Equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and a journal, he set off into the dense forest, following an old dirt road until the eerie wooden cabin emerged from the fog. The structure was decrepit, with moss-covered wooden beams and windows clouded with dust. Ethan stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the single-room interior. A stone fireplace stood at the far end, its hearth filled with crumbling ash. An old wooden table sat in the center, its surface covered in scratches. But it was the silence that unsettled him the most. It felt oppressive, almost expectant. As night fell, Ethan set up his equipment and prepared for any signs of activity. Hours passed without incident, and he was beginning to dismiss the stories as mere folklore. Then, just past midnight, the first whisper came. It was faint, like the murmur of someone speaking from the other side of a wall. Ethan froze, adjusting his recorder. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Yet he couldn't make out the words. His skin prickled. "Who's there?" he called out. The voices ceased instantly, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. His flashlight flickered. The temperature dropped drastically, and he could see his breath in the air. Panic clawed at his chest as the whispers resumed, this time forming coherent words. "Get out. Get out before it wakes." Ethan's hands trembled as he reviewed his audio recorder. The whispers were there, proof that he wasn't imagining things. But before he could process the significance, a loud thud echoed from the fireplace. He turned just in time to see something move in the darkness, something shifting within the shadows of the chimney. The whispers turned to frantic screams. A dark, emaciated figure emerged, its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan. It had been waiting. The voices were not a threat, they had been a warning. He bolted for the door, fumbling with the latch as the thing dragged itself toward him with unnatural, jerking movements. As soon as he stumbled outside, the noises stopped. The cabin was silent once more, its sinister presence retreating into the shadows. Ethan didn't stop running until he reached his car. When he finally dared to look back, the cabin stood just as he had found it, lonely, still, and watching. Ethan never returned. His footage was corrupted, his recordings filled with nothing but static. But on some nights, deep in the Blackwood forest, travelers still hear the ghostly voices whispering their warning. Get out before it wakes. Months later, curiosity gnawed at Ethan. He tried to ignore it, but nightmares plagued his sleep. In them, the whispers were clearer, more desperate. Against his better judgment, he reached out to an old colleague, Dr. Claire Holloway, a paranormal researcher with years of experience studying haunted locations. Claire was intrigued by Ethan's account. Together, they devised a plan. She would return to the cabin with him, bringing more advanced equipment. If the voices were intelligent, perhaps they could communicate. Under the full moon, they made their way back. The cabin looked unchanged, still standing ominously against the thick trees. This time, Claire brought electromagnetic field detectors, thermal cameras, and an array of sensors to detect disturbances. They sat up for the night, waiting. Just after midnight, the whispers returned. This time, Claire's devices went haywire, readings spiked, cameras glitched. The whispers morphed into distressed cries. And then, amidst the chaos, a voice broke through clearly. Help us. Ethan and Claire exchanged glances, shock and fear reflecting in their eyes. Claire took a step closer to the fireplace, her voice steady but cautious. Who are you? Why are you here? The response came in fragments, layered voices forming a chilling chorus. Trapped, the monster, the fire. Ethan's mind raced. The stories about the cabin had never mentioned a fire, yet the words sent a wave of dread through him. He reached for his journal, flipping through the pages of research he had compiled. Then he found it, a brief mention of a family that had lived here over a century ago. A fire had destroyed part of the cabin, and the family had vanished without a trace. Before they could ask more, the entity inside the chimney stirred. The walls shook. The door rattled. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm. We have to leave. Now. But Ethan hesitated. What if we can help them? A guttural roar erupted from the fireplace, shaking the entire cabin. The thing inside was waking up. The whispers turned into screams of terror. Run! They bolted for the door as the temperature plummeted. The creature emerged again, faster this time, its elongated fingers grasping at them. Claire shoved Ethan forward, barely dodging its grasp. They burst into the cold night air, gasping. Behind them, the cabin's door slammed shut on its own. The windows darkened. The whispers faded. Claire turned to Ethan, her breath unsteady. We need to find out what really happened here. Ethan nodded, his fear giving way to a new determination. Whatever haunted the cabin wasn't just a lingering spirit, it was something ancient, something angry. And they weren't done with it yet. The Cursed Island Resort. Lana and her friends, Tom, Jake, Natalie, and Sophia, were always looking for unique getaways, exploring abandoned places and seeking out adventure. One day, they came across an ad for a secluded, abandoned resort called Isla Maldita. The ad promised a luxurious island experience, unlike anything else, and stated that only a select few guests would be allowed. They immediately made a reservation. After all, for a group that thrived on adrenaline and the thrill of discovery, this seemed like the perfect opportunity. But what they didn't know was that this island would change their lives forever and pull them into a dark, tragic history. The boat ride to Isla Maldita was eerie. The ocean was deep and unnervingly dark. The captain, Mateo, didn't speak a word as he steered the boat toward the island. As they approached, the resort's exterior seemed beautiful from a distance, but closer up, it looked more like a crumbling, forsaken ruin. Upon arrival, the only person who greeted them was Isabella, a strange woman. She spoke in hushed tones and offered them a set of rules that must be followed. Do not leave your rooms after midnight. Never enter room 306. If you hear a knock at your door, do not open it. If you see a figure on the beach at dawn, do not look at it. Lana found the rules odd but didn't think too much of it. Yet, something about the island felt wrong. She decided not to mention it to her friends. That night, Lana was awoken by a series of knocks at her door. Knock, 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 the sound reverberated through the silence of the night. Her heart began to race. Should she answer it? But then she remembered the rule, never open the door if there's a knock. The knocking continued, growing closer and closer. Then, a voice whispered, "Lana, open the door." Lana lay still, terrified, her breath shallow. The sounds continued, getting louder and more desperate, yet she refused to open the door. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The next morning, no one mentioned the noises they had heard during the night, but there was an undeniable sense of unease. They tried to shake off the discomfort by heading out to explore the resort. But the island felt oppressive. Everywhere they went, it felt as though they were being watched. One particular spot caught their attention, the notorious room 306. Despite knowing the danger, curiosity got the better of them. Jake, always the bravest, urged the group to go inside. The moment they opened the door to room 306, they felt the atmosphere shift. The room was unnervingly cold, and the walls were covered in strange, moving wallpaper. As if trapped beneath the surface, distorted faces seemed to shift and leer at them, their eyes wide in silent screams. Jake hesitated, and as he took a step back, the door slammed shut behind them. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The room seemed to close in on them, and the air felt thick and suffocating. They struggled, but the door wouldn't budge. They quickly backed away, the unsettling faces on the walls mocking their fear. They rushed out of the room, but the oppressive presence of the island seemed to follow them. That night, things took a darker turn. Again, the knocking came. But this time, it wasn't just at Lana's door, it was everywhere. It came from the walls, the floors, as though the entire building was alive, watching them. The group tried to sleep, but the fear kept them awake. Lana received a message on her phone from Isabella, "Leave now. You still have time." But when they tried to leave, they discovered they were trapped. The windows wouldn't open, the doors were locked tight. And then, they saw it. On the beach, in the distance, stood a tall figure motionless, staring at them with hollow eyes. The figure stood completely still, its gaze piercing the night. They knew they weren't supposed to look, but it was too late. The figure's presence felt unnatural, almost suffocating. Desperation set in as they searched for an escape, but it seemed impossible. The doors slammed shut behind them every time they tried to leave. The walls closed in as though the building itself was swallowing them whole. The island was not just a place, it was a living entity, one that had claimed them. As the night stretched on, Lana realized the truth: Isla Maldita had accepted them, and it would never let them go. The next morning, Lana's friends were gone. One by one, they had vanished without a trace, as if swallowed by the island itself. The island had claimed them, just like it had claimed so many before them. The whispers, the knocking, the figure on the beach, it was all a part of Isla Maldita's twisted ritual. Time passed, and the island remained. The same ad was still being run for new guests, an experience like no other. Another group set sail for Isla Maldita, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The island was patient, always waiting for its next visitors. As dawn broke, the figure stood on the beach once more, watching. Its hollow eyes never left the horizon. Isla Maldita was always watching, always waiting for new souls to claim. Phantom passenger on the road trip. It was supposed to be the road trip of a lifetime. Four friends, Jake, Sam, Lisa, and Emily, had planned a cross-country journey through the most scenic routes of America. They rented a spacious SUV, packed it with camping gear, and set out with a playlist of road trip anthems, ready to make memories. The first few days were filled with laughter, breathtaking views, and late-night campfires. But everything changed when they decided to take a detour through an old, abandoned highway in Arizona. The road was cracked and desolate, winding through miles of barren desert with no sign of civilization. It started with the static on the radio. Then, the GPS malfunctioned. The map spun erratically, the glowing blue dot marking their location flickering on and off. They were alone on that road until they weren't. A lone hitchhiker stood by the roadside, a young woman in a long, pale dress. Her head was bowed, long black hair covering her face. Against their better judgment, Sam, who was driving, slowed down. "She looks lost," Lisa murmured. "Maybe we should help her," Emily added hesitantly. Jake, the most skeptical of the group, scoffed. "Guys, this is literally how horror movies start." Still, against Jake's protests, they pulled over. The woman didn't move until Lisa rolled down her window. "Do you need a ride?" she asked. Slowly, the woman lifted her head. Her face was impossibly pale, her eyes hollow and dark. Without a word, she opened the back door and slid in beside Emily. A sickly sweet scent filled the car like rotting flowers. The drive continued in silence. The woman didn't speak, didn't react to their questions, only staring ahead. A strange heaviness settled in the SUV, and the temperature inside dropped. The air conditioner wasn't even on. Lisa turned back to say something, but the words caught in her throat. The woman's hands, long, skeletal fingers, were gripping the seat with inhuman strength. Her nails, cracked and yellowed, dug into the fabric. Emily clutched Jake's arm. "I don't feel right," she whispered. Then the woman turned her head too far, like an owl. Her lips curled into an unnatural smile. And she whispered one word: "Stop." Sam slammed the brakes. The car screeched to a halt. The woman was gone. The back seat was empty. Heart pounding, Jake jumped out, scanning the area. Nothing. Just a dark, empty road stretching endlessly into the desert night. But then Lisa gasped. On the window, in smeared, bloody letters, were the words, "You should never have stopped." Terrified, they sped away, vowing never to speak of the phantom passenger again. But when they checked the photos from their trip later, in the reflection of the SUV's back window, they saw her. The pale woman, grinning at them from the darkness. That night, none of them could sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw her face, her hollow eyes, that eerie, knowing grin. Emily woke up screaming, claiming she felt icy fingers brushing her cheek. Lisa swore she heard whispers in her ear, a voice mimicking her own. The paranoia only grew as they continued their journey. They noticed strange occurrences, shadows flickering in their peripheral vision, the radio turning on by itself, the car doors locking and unlocking at random. Jake, the skeptic, was the first to break. "We need to do something. This isn't normal." Desperate, they searched online for any legends about the highway. What they found made their blood run cold. Stories of a phantom hitchhiker, a woman who died decades ago on that road after a brutal attack. Drivers who picked her up were doomed to be haunted until they found a way to put her spirit to rest. But there was no clear way to do so. Panic set in. They tried retracing their steps, returning to the highway, but no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find the exact spot where they had picked her up. It was as if the road itself had changed. Then, on the last night of their trip, Emily disappeared. One moment, she was sitting by the campfire, staring blankly into the flames, and the next, she was gone. No footsteps, no sign of struggle, just vanished. They searched frantically, but it was useless. Only the whispering wind responded to their cries. When they checked Emily's tent, they found a single message scrawled on the inside of the fabric, written in the same smeared, bloody script. "She is mine now." The remaining three fled, abandoning their gear, driving nonstop until they reached civilization. They filed a missing person report, but deep down, they knew the truth. Emily wasn't coming back. To this day, none of them speak of what happened on that road trip. But sometimes, when Sam drives alone at night, he sees her in his rearview mirror, the phantom passenger, watching, waiting for her next ride.